Mac, lovely to be talking to you. I could do a big introduction of you, but how about you introduce yourself to get us started?
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Mac Barnes. I'm 19 years old, and I'm currently a sophomore at Washington University in St. Louis, studying computer science with a second major in fiber art.
Amazing. So tell me, Mac, how did you get into quilting?
Yeah, so I originally I think got into crochet with my grandmother. So I think that's probably the place to start. So she taught me to crochet when I was about 7 years old, because her church group made these beautiful red, white, and blue blankets for wounded. They called them wounded warriors, but like wounded
Hmm.
veterans. And so I really got involved in that community because I was really close to my grandparents. And so I learned to crochet, but she would say, go on YouTube and look up this new technique, and then you'll figure it out. So I would do that. But as YouTube works, they slowly suggest other things. So I started watching knitting videos. I was like, oh, that'd be really interesting to try. So I tried that. And then eventually it started recommending a lot of videos from Jenny Doan and other sort of like big quilting names. And I really, that's when they were sort of like becoming the people who they are as well. So I really enjoyed watching those. And I think that's what I really fell in love with, was the quilt medium. And then I was about 9 or so. And so I would go home and I would try and recreate what was in these videos. And a lot of them were like traditional patterns. But then it sort of snowballed from there. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so I can only imagine that if YouTube algorithm had started recommending like martial arts videos, this conversation could be very different. But
Yeah.
I'm very glad that it started with the quilting. So, what was your first quilt that you worked on?
Yeah. So I think that I remember the earliest one I can remember was that was like sort of finished was actually so my mom's an elementary school teacher. So she wanted something for the front of her big black metal desk. And so I made this sort of like mini quilt that covered the front of it. It was like a typical chevron pattern. I remember following, it was made out of these like blue and white like rags that I had, it was like branded like cut up curtains or something. And I remember making that and like making it for her desk. And that was like sort of the first time I had made something like of a substantial size, that I guess you could really call a quilt. Um,
Oh,
I was
that's
I was maybe
awesome.
11 or so. Yeah.
Oh, is she still teaching? Does she still have
She
it?
still teaches. Yeah, she still teaches. I don't think she's I don't think it's still up on her desk. Because little kids come up
Of course,
and
yes.
it definitely had its fair share of, and it was not definitely like well made at all, but I'm sure it's around still somewhere.
Oh, that's lovely. So tell us, you mentioned that you're at Washington, and I think, am I right? You're doing computer science and studio art, or yeah.
Yes.
Tell us about how the two combine. Like, how do those two worlds interact?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked this because I think a lot of times people assume that they're just such different worlds. And I think the more I've been like taking classes and been sort of in this space, I realize that they're very, very similar. And maybe I'll sort of give an example. So I took the WashU hosted this crochet class where they brought in a software developer who crocheted on the side. I was like, oh, that's cool that there's someone else who does both. But she taught this crochet class to both art students and computer science students in the same room. And to the computer science students, or to the art students, she gave them the typical crochet pattern that we're used to seeing. And it was something very simple in the round. But for the computer science students, they're like, I don't understand that. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I can never do that. But she had instructions for them written in Java, which is a coding language, or it was sort of pseudocode, but based on Java. And they're like, oh, I can do that. It's the same pattern, and they ended up making the same thing, but they just had different instructions. And so I think that's sort of the mindset that I like to think of it as, like computer science and quilting, or any sort of fiber art, really, in my mind, are really the same sort of, at their core, the same processes, and same attention to detail. We just have different instructions and different goals with what we're trying to do with it. And so
That's
I really enjoyed exploring how those sort of crossover.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to be confronted with that viewpoint that
Mhm.
there's so many similarities. It's just almost just the language that you're speaking that divides the worlds.
Yeah, and I think there's also like a social barrier to it because we talk to like I'll talk to quilters or crocheters all the time. They'll be like, "Oh, you're a computer science student. Like, I could never do that." And I'm like, "The project that I'm watching you work on right now is literally the same things that you'd be doing. You just be typing them into a computer, which we all do, So I feel like there's sort of the social, mindset of like, I'm left brain, I'm right brain. I'm like, you're doing the same thing.
Fascinating. So, and tell us, the piece of art on the wall there, is that some
Mhm.
of your work?
Yeah, so the piece up here, I think, is a good example of where I like to see computer science and quilting sort of overlap. So this was a collaboration with another St. Louis artist. His name is Matt Bryan, or Matt's Pixel Garden on Instagram, and he takes photos from really any source, but a lot of times it's nature around St. Louis, and runs them through these algorithms that he codes. But really, all that means is like it changes where every pixel in the image goes, or it changes their color, or it groups them in some way. And so this photo right here is actually from a video game. So not a photo taken from her life, but it's a video game that I was actually trying to emulate oil paintings and its graphics, which I think is kind of cool. But it created these really interesting shapes and blocks that, and also it's maybe hard to see, but these striations within it, like that just it happened because that's how he wrote the algorithm. And it uses basic math that we probably all learned in like high school geometry, but uses them in a really interesting way. And so I saw this and I was like, that looks like a quilt. And so this was my reference as I was making on the design wall next to it, a quilt that was sort of a one-to-one of this image, and it used turn edge applique and a lot of traditional quilt skills that we see, like turn edge applique, or um, using like a scrap busting quilt because there was a lot of tiny pieces, or you starch fabrics around a paper template, kind of like English paper piecing. So all of those things were used to create this sort of image that was made digitally, but like create it in a 3D space, which I thought was really interesting. And so I really enjoyed it. And I still have some of that, variegated stitching to do.
Mhm.
But I think that's a great way to sort of explain how you can like tell a story with a quilt by like bringing something that's digital into the physical world and add like another layer of it. Um,
Absolutely, because I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of kind of pixelating an
mhm,
image to
yeah.
represent it in fabric, and then you work in blocks. And there's a number of different artists that are doing that kind of thing. But this sounds like a different technique where you're kind of transforming those blocks somehow into something else.
Yeah, it's just like pixelation, except it's a little bit different. It's
Mm,
we're not just taking it and like making it blurry. We're taking it and we're grouping colors together into like a lot of these are like just like rectangles with a little something else added to them. So
mhm.
it's like all these rectangular blocks that, grouped colors together, or it's if you saw the reference image, you'd be like, "Oh, I see how, you got from one to the other." But if you just look at this image, you're like, "Well, what is it?" But it's just like pixelating, except a little bit different. And I think there's some more interesting shapes in there and some colors that get pulled out, some elements of the natural image that we normally couldn't see that we now get to enjoy.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to be asking you for a picture of the quilt when it's finished,
Yes.
so I can put it along with this interview because I'm sure people will be fascinated to see what you've made. Speaking of what you've made, let's talk about the workshop that you're going to be doing, because you've got this way with t-shirt quilts that really struck me when I first saw it, and I was thinking like, this is not how other people are approaching them. So tell us about the workshop.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this because again, I think t-shirt quilts is a more traditional way that we see quilts, and they're sort of passed over by, so I think sometimes the sort of modern community as being too simple or too easy to make, or just lacking in technique sometimes.
Mhm.
But I think that it's a missed opportunity because I mean we live our lives in these t-shirts that we turn into quilts, and they have such interesting stories, emotions, more than I think our fabric stashes do. And I feel like that is a really missed opportunity to tell a story through a quilt, whether it's about a person, a community, a company. And so I wanted to push it a little bit further after doing a few traditional t-shirt quilts. I even did some of the ones where it was like sort of the mismatched blocks, but it was still sort of the blocks. Um, I had all these YMCA t-shirts, and I was like, I just don't think it would do it justice to just have everything cut out in a square. And like, this is such a complex community, at least the YMCA was, with all these members and all these stories. And I just loved the graphics of the shirts. I mean, I didn't even have to really do anything because all the colors went together. And I've been following some other glass artists and that did fused glass. And I was like, well, that looks kind of cool. And so I like took some, samples from that and some inspiration from those artists and created what I thought kind of looked like fused glass, but through t-shirt quilts. And so you get all the sort of patterned elements in the text and whatever, but you also get this wonderful shape, and where the shape tells a story too. And I really liked doing that. So that's what this class is about. It's how do you come up with those shapes? How do you tell a compelling narrative with these t-shirts that you have in a way that is a step above what we would normally see, and is also visually interesting to look at.
Now that you've said that, I can absolutely see what you mean about the fused glass, having seen the quilt, the YMCA one. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that's really interesting. Are these other people on campus, or are they people that you follow online?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. So there is an instructor on campus. His name is Rob Morgan, and he does set design, but like stained glass on the side. And
Mhm.
so I definitely have really enjoyed looking at his work and in the studio and when he does like restoration. But there's also another artist, particularly like glass art by Linda, I think is her name, but that was like another thing. I was like, she does fused glass, not like the typical stained glass, and I'd never seen that before. So kind of all over. And St. Louis has so much stained glass that I just love, and I think it's nice to sort of take what you like from other mediums and sort of bring them into quilting. It's always a fun time.
Well, yeah, that's what I was thinking, because there's a number of teachers that are doing that now that I think about it. Like Mel Beach has got the blocks that she's been printing, and she does loads of mixed media stuff. There's another woman whose name temporarily escapes me, but she's doing free motion embroidery using photographs and
Mm.
paintings and so on. But I guess I hadn't really thought about how, diversifying who you follow outside of quilting brings you all these additional inspirations. I guess it's just something that some people do naturally, and their work benefits from it. And the workshop also uses Procreate. So for people that don't know about Procreate, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as we know like Photoshop and Illustrator exist, but these are like these big scary programs with high costs and lots of tools. Like I even get put off by them. But Procreate is a very simplified version that is made for an iPad. So it's made to sort of make the process of mark making digitally really simple and intuitive, similar to as close to as it would be with on paper. And what I also like is that you can it's really simple, but you can do a lot with it. You can make it really complex. And so a lot of the raw edge applique pieces I've done, or this t-shirt quilt, or, there's so many uses into the quilting space where you can draw things and use those drawings to create quilts. And so a lot of people use it for all kinds of other reasons, but for me, I love using it to know what I wanted. If we're not improvisationally piecing, how can you like mess around and see how the quilt will look before you go and do all the process to make it? So that's different from sort of like the improv piecing where you're sort of just like going at it, and you don't really want to plan it out. If you do want to plan it out, I have just basically every quilt I've made that I've planned out, I've used Procreate for. Um, because you can pull colors that you want that are exact to your fabrics. You can draw things, you can erase. There's a back button. So I love using it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan as well. And one of the things I've used it for extensively is I'll take a picture of the finished top of the quilt and plan the quilting
That's
over it, because you can just draw on the picture. And then like you say, you just erase it if you don't like what you've done, or make another version with a variation.
and
So,
that's how this one was done. I used that as a reference, and I drew out. That's how I made my paper stencil.
oh,
I drew
awesome.
on top of it. I also drew out the stitching that I wanted, and just printed it out. And that I had a one-to-one quilting stencil. You can like from this. I don't want all this information. I want like a simplified version. So you can
Sure.
just draw right on top of it.
That's brilliant. All right. Well, yeah, that's great. It's such a useful tool. And like you say, it's very inexpensive and it's a one-off. I think it's like $12 or something. So
Mhm.
it's a one-off rather than having to pay monthly like all those other ones.
I also like that.
So we've talked, you've mentioned multiple inspirations that you have and that feed into your work. Are there other people that you find particularly inspiring?
Yeah. And I think that a lot of my answers so far have been around people that are outside of the quilting space, like stained glass artists or digital artists that I think we can really sort of push the quilting medium with, taking inspiration from. But on the quilting side, I think I have really enjoyed not just getting to know her, but like seeing her work evolve. Paula Kovarik, who juried a show that I was in, I think, gosh, now 2 years ago. And then I got the opportunity to take a class with her for a week on using Stitch, and it was sort of this improvisational mindset. So a lot of the quilts I'd made before were super planned out, super precise, and I kind of felt stuck. Painters can just sort of like brush over a canvas,
Mm.
and I felt like sort of stuck that I couldn't really do that with quilting. But Paula sort of showed me that like you can. And I also really love her work that looks at I think she calls it stitch descent. So how do you like create conversations or create a voice with quilting? Not just something that's pretty to look at, but that has something else to say.
Oh
And
yeah.
her bio, I think, also says like I stitch to say things without words. And if that wasn't already taken, that would be my bio. So you know, I just really admire her desire to push the medium in this way and to sort of have her own narrative and her own voice and like express that voice through like fabric and quilting in a really interesting way that I haven't seen from really any other artist.
Yeah, and she has a great newsletter as well. I know I've been
Mhm.
following it for quite a while, and yeah, I'm also an admirer of her work as well. Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a lot of inspiration to be taken, like again, like you said, from other artists and other mathematicians. Like I
Mhm.
think like historical figures like Alan Turing, for example, or these
Oh
other
yeah,
sort of or Keith Haring, or these other sorts of people that you would not associate with quilting. But I think there is so much to be said about how they problem solve and how they don't sort of exist in a bubble. Like they lived in a society that appreciated or didn't appreciate them. And I think there's a lot to be learned there and a lot to dive into. And or even if you look outside of just like art or mathematics, looking at in diversity and inclusion spaces, how do we make quilting a more diverse and inclusive space? I think there's a lot of people like mentors of mine that I personally look up to,
mm,
like our director for diversity and inclusion at Watch U, who I pull inspiration from because you sort of start to notice like, is quilting the most inclusive space? So I would say a lot of my inspiration are some of these big names, but also people that I just know personally that I think are say things that I never would have thought of and have made me sort of see the world in a
absolutely.
different place.
Yeah, I mean, surrounding yourself with inspiring people and having that community is, yeah, there's nothing like that, I think. So yeah. Now we're recording this in November, and you just mentioned you earlier that you'd finished your midterms before we started this recording. So obviously academic stuff is undoubtedly top of mind, but are there things you have in mind for 2024 that you want to be doing?
Yeah, so I think there's something really important to be said about like building a quilting community, like where you are, if you're into quilting or just any kind of community. And I recently moved to St. Louis like a year ago. So I think my big goals for 2024 are to really engage with the community here in St. Louis. So I'm a member of the Modern Quilt Guild here. So I'm really excited to get to it's a quite a large group. So getting to know all those members. We also have two fabric resale stores that take in lots of what otherwise would be waste and resells them and creates a community out of that. So I'm really excited in getting involved. And there's two in St. Louis, which I feel like is really amazing. And so just finding all these like little pockets of where does sewing show up and where does fabric show up? Also, like you mentioned, academics. I think part of that also can intertwine with textiles. So one of my goals for 2024 is I'm working with a company that's looking at how do we recycle textiles in a way that gives back to our community. It's like that's a really big part of it, part of the conversation. Like, how do you be a sustainable quilter? And how do you use your knowledge of textiles to like make the world a better place? So I think that's sort of a big goal of mine, is to explore that, even if it doesn't go anywhere, to just explore it. And then also there's just several projects I want to do. I've delved a little bit more into the world of like hand sewing, so I think that'd be kind of
Mm.
cool to see where that goes. Again, more influences with computer science and quilting. I have my quilting frame behind me, and one of my goals for the year is to computerize it
Oh,
using old
wow.
parts from a 3D printer that I have, and sort of like,
Oh, you're
yeah,
going to
and
build your own long arm machine.
yeah, so
You
that's one
create-
of my
Oh my
goals.
goodness.
Because this was from another local St. Louisan, who no longer needed it, and so I was fortunate enough to get it, and so I want to, use it and see if I can computerize it in some way. So I've been working on that. So hopefully I'll have that
Amazing.
working, to create, again, quilts that tell better stories. So yeah,
Oh my goodness. So you're going to be busy,
I
basically,
am
is
going to be
what I'm
busy.
hearing. There's another teacher, Julia McLeod, who's doing a workshop on upcycling and repurposing found fabric. And there's a couple of those fabric repurposing places in the Bay Area, one in San Francisco, one in Oakland, and I think there's a couple of others that I absolutely love. And in fact, I was at one of them yesterday, although I've told myself I'm not allowed to buy any more fabric. So
When they sell it at $2 or $3 a pound, or for
absolutely.
this, like this quilt was all repurposed textiles, because most of the what I do is repurposed, because I need a lot of colors and I need a little bit of each color. So, ours has a free section where it's like even smaller cuts, and so it's really hard to say no. Uh,
Absolutely. I know well, yes, that's how I've ended up with so much, I think. All right. You've got your teacher page, which has got all your links and everything on there, and I'll put some links to the people that we've talked about in the interview notes. Is there anything else we should talk about before we say goodbye?
I think you've asked really good questions. Yeah, the only other thing I would maybe want to touch on is maybe some more of that like business side,
Mm,
because it shows up so often in art, and I feel like it doesn't get talked about. And as a computer science and art student, like I'm in a program where we're supposed to find ways where those collide.
mhm,
Um, and so one of the spaces I found is entrepreneurship, and WashU has a big entrepreneurship program. And one of my sort of roles in that community is looking at, as a venture capital analyst, looking at startups and evaluating their companies to like connect them with funding. And
mhm.
this maybe sounds completely unrelated to the world of quilting, but
Keep going,
I
keep
have
going.
I have found that, when we make quilts to tell stories, and we do them to connect people in ways that, like we said, words cannot. And I think that skill has been, you know hugely important when you're trying to understand companies, and that are, new companies and startups that are trying to, um, create a business and create a community, right? You're evaluating their story, as opposed to making one. And I have found that it has really informed my quilting and my understanding of how do we tell better stories. And I think that the venture capital or entrepreneurship space is often shut out to the artist community, because artists don't see themselves in that light. But I often think that the best people in those spaces make the best entrepreneurs. um, One example from WashU would be Jim McKelvey. I would really highly recommend anyone to go, look up his story. But he created Square,
Yeah.
because, and he's an alum of WashU, but he created Square because he was a glass artist, and he needed a way to have payments quickly, right? So this is an
Oh,
artist who found a problem in the community and solved it, but not just solved it for him, but solved it in a way that was hugely profitable, and I think this conversation of like art and profitability, like, need to be had more. So I just want to like put that out to people, that you're not excluded from that space, and that all entrepreneurship is solving problems. And I feel like that's all we do when we try and make a quilt that we think of in our head, is we solve problems. And that I think we could all lean into that more.
That is fascinating, because I doubt there's many people, certainly in America, that haven't heard of Square. I don't know about its international reach, but I'm sure most of us have used Square payment processing at some point, even just paying for things. And in fact, my local guild is having an auction tomorrow, and we've just bought some Square readers to take payments because they are so convenient. But I had no idea that he was a glass person, and he was behind the company. That's fascinating. And I think what you're saying about telling stories, because I know with startups, I mean, I'm in the Bay Area, which is like startup crazy. And there's so many people always talking about pitch decks and how to tell a story and things like that. And the idea that you're also trying to tell a story with your quilting, that is a fascinating cross into different worlds. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for adding that. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, that's how they get funding, is they submit a pitch deck. Like, they're not there in person, and you have to tell a really compelling story with it. And I think that us as artists, like, we have really interesting lens to look at those stories and evaluate them, or make, either on the making the pitch decks or on evaluating them to, like, will this company be profitable? And I think that's a really valuable skill set that isn't talked about a lot. And yeah, Jim McKelvey, he owns a glass factory right down the street from me. It's a whole makers district that has come out of Square, and I believe he still makes glass, which is really interesting.
I'm wondering whether anyone will be submitting a pitch quilt in future rather than a pitch deck. Obviously, silliness, but still.
Cool. I would be interested in that.
All right. Well, Mac, it's been fascinating to talk to you. I'm so glad. And I'm delighted you're taking part in this event as a teacher. People can read all about you on your teacher page and see all your social links and subscribe and so on. And yeah, looking forward to the workshop.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks.